In 1944, Paris, considered one of the most beautiful cities in the world, was completely in the hands of the Nazis. Its citizens had already endured 4 years of occupation, 4 years of suffering at the hands of the Germans and their collaborators. But the winds were changing. The Allies had invaded Europe and were defeating the German forces. The crisis of the Germans was visible to all. The French people, always known for their resilience, felt inspired to achieve their long-awaited liberation, with or without Allied help. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about one of the most inspiring events, which occurred during one of the darkest moments in history, the liberation of Paris in full color. For many historians, the fall of France in 1940 was the event where the world became aware of what was to come. The French command and its allies had underestimated Adolf Hitler, and consequently, the country was in his hands. From here, the German government had ample freedom of movement for its conquest campaign, leaving the Allied forces without a strong foothold in continental Europe. France was soon divided, with one half occupied, while the other saw the establishment of the Vichy puppet state. The City of Light fell within the occupied half. The government headquarters shifted to the city of Vichy, but the conquest of the former capital held undeniable symbolic value. Hitler, who considered Paris the most beautiful city in the world, wasted no time in celebrating his victory by touring it. He was seen on the Champs-Élysées, the Arc de Triomphe, and obviously the Eiffel Tower. Let's now watch a video of the Führer strolling with his men through the newly conquered city. The citizens were subjected to rationing of food and other goods, a curfew that forbade movement in the city at night, and the takeover of the media by the Germans, who began circulating propaganda in their favor. Any Parisian who dared to rebel was harshly suppressed. Nevertheless, the Nazis could not prevent the emergence of civilian resistance. These individuals, called maquis, formed clandestine groups that took sabotage actions against the invaders, sometimes even attacking their officers. Some of them were communists, while others were loyal to General Charles de Gaulle, who served as the leader of Free France. Despite their different loyalties, they were united in their goal of expelling the Germans from the City of Light. However, they would have to wait a long time for an opportunity. Next, you'll hear the words of a resistance member explaining why they joined the movement.
Si quelqu'un vient chez vous, vous tape dessus, vide votre frigo, bat les gosses et casse tout, qu'est-ce que vous faites si vous êtes quelqu'un d'honorable? Vous les fiches d'or, hein? Ben, moi, les Allemands, je voulais les fiches d'or. Et la seule façon de les fiches d'or, c'est de les tuer.
The opportunity for the French would come 4 years later. Following the successful Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, the Allies were advancing rapidly into the interior of France. The Germans, desperate, tried by all means to control the advance of their enemies, but they were disorganized, and cities that they had conquered years ago were being liberated by Allied forces. Hitler had ordered that only he would make all military decisions, so the Germans were forced to wait for information to reach Berlin and then return to the front. Thus, while they yielded more and more territory, they found themselves cornered by the troops led by Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower. In the Falaise pocket, almost 2 entire German armies were cornered. Desperate, they were forced to retreat in broad daylight at the mercy of Allied aircraft fire. 50,000 men were captured, and although many tens of thousands were able to escape, they had to leave their tanks and heavy weaponry behind. They no longer had any hope of halting the advance of their enemies. You can see below the testimonies of a German soldier and an American soldier narrating the frantic German escape from the Allied encirclement.
Many stopped in their tracks and tried to find cover, but it wasn't possible. because the fire came from all sides.
We were attacking German tank concentrations. It was a continuous attack with very effective results.
Perhaps surprisingly, in the initial plans of the Allies, the liberation of Paris may not have been considered. Entering this city would have slowed down the march towards Berlin, the main objective of the invasion of Europe. Additionally, all the resources required to liberate and protect Paris could have been used on other fronts to bring about the enemy's downfall more quickly. Flanking the city and continuing to advance would have left the Nazi garrison installed in the city isolated from the support of the German army. For these reasons, the liberation of Paris did not present a strategic advantage. The French didn't agree with this analysis. They couldn't wait for the fall of Berlin. They needed to expel the invaders from their capital city and destroy the collaborationist Vichy regime. Upon hearing the news of the Allied advance, Parisians were emboldened, sensing that their liberation was near. On August 15, 1944, employees of the Paris Metro and the police decided not to show up for work. 3 days later, workers across the country, led by the French Communist Party, joined in, declaring a general strike. German soldiers suppressed the French employees. There were casualties, but the strike persisted. Meanwhile, radios and newspapers controlled by the French forces of the interior called for a popular civil insurrection. The German garrison, although still significant, was not as numerous, as some troops were fighting on the French front, while others had been withdrawn to protect German territory from a possible future invasion. On August 19th, while the Allied troops still hesitated to enter Paris, real skirmishes began between German soldiers and the French population. Members of the police seized the prefecture and began firing at the occupying forces. Men, women, and children erected barricades in the streets, hindering the movement of Nazi vehicles. Third Reich banners were lowered and replaced by the tricolor flag. Amidst the gunfire, people sang the Marseillaise. The French forces of the interior ordered citizens, "Everyone to the barricades." The liberation of Paris did not begin with an attack by the Allies, but with the uprising of its own people. 1 day later, the military governor of Paris, Dietrich von Choltitz, negotiated a ceasefire with the French resistance. Unaware that the Allies were planning to bypass the city, Choltitz ordered several of his troops to withdraw, seeing it as unlikely that they could successfully defend the city. However, several partisan groups ignored the ceasefire and attacks continued. On August 22nd, the fighting in Paris intensified. The Germans began to counterattack, openly firing at the civilian population. The Grand Palais, which served as a stronghold for the resistance, was fired upon while tanks cleared the barricades. On August 23rd, Adolf Hitler, furious about the course of the war, ordered Choltitz to inflict maximum damage on the city. He preferred to see one of his favorite cities burn rather than fall into the hands of his enemies. Explosives were placed on numerous bridges and monuments throughout the city. Upon learning that the French resistance was rising against their oppressors, de Gaulle urged American Commander Eisenhower to begin a frontal attack on Paris. The French leader did not want the citizens of Paris to suffer the same fate as the Polish resistance in the Warsaw Uprising, where the Soviets had not come to the aid of the partisans, and they were being crushed by the Nazis. De Gaulle warned Eisenhower that if the rebels were not assisted, the Germans would annihilate them. Additionally, if the rebellion was not intervened in, the French communists would see their position strengthened as they were taking over the leadership of the insurgency. The French even threatened to ignore the chain of command and attack the German garrison solely with their forces if the Allies did not comply with their request. However, despite sympathizing with the Parisian population, Eisenhower turned a deaf ear to his comrades' complaints. On August 24th, General Philippe Leclerc, with de Gaulle's permission, disobeyed his American superior and sent the vanguard of his 2nd Armored Division to Paris. They engaged in combat with the entrenched German troops on the outskirts, forcing them to retreat. Leclerc's insubordinate maneuver forced the hand of the Allies. Believing he could not stop the French from liberating their capital, Eisenhower ordered the other divisions to assist the soldiers of Free France. Meanwhile, civilians celebrated Leclerc's entry. They sang the national anthem, accompanied the tanks' march, and bells rang in the churches. Soldiers received kisses, flowers, and bottles of wine. You can see below the testimonies of military and civilians from those days.
They had set up an old-fashioned record player, the kind with the big flared horn. And a man came out and he started La Marseillaise.
And my grandmother at that time called me, and she had prepared a basket with fresh and raw apples in it. So I took that and I gave it to him, and I had my first chocolate that day.
Wonderful, wonderful. They give you a kiss and hug, and they give you the wine. They had some of the best wine that you can drink too, So it was a joyous time.
On the morning of August 25th, Allied troops continued to advance. Leclerc's division entered through the Porte d'Orléans, while La Neuve, a company mostly composed of Republican veterans from the Spanish Civil War, entered through the Porte d'Italie. The Americans, led by General Leonard T. Jarrow, followed shortly after, heading to the Paris City Hall to reinforce the resistance of the French forces of the interior. Choltitz knew he had no chance of defending the city. Most of his troops had withdrawn, leaving only 20,000 soldiers who now faced not only the Allies, but also 3 million empowered Parisians hungry for freedom. The main dilemma for the German general lay elsewhere. Should he obey the Führer and destroy Paris, or would he disobey? While he decided what to do, he informed his superiors of non-existent maneuvers, although the idea of surrender was already forming in his mind. Supposedly, at the same time that the Allied attack advanced towards the city center, Hitler called Choltitz and asked, "Is Paris burning?" His response is not known. In the afternoon, Choltitz's headquarters was assaulted, and the German commander was taken prisoner. Around 3 p.m., in front of General Leclerc, Choltitz signed the surrender of the German occupation forces. After 4 long years, Paris was free. Choltitz, for disobeying Hitler's orders, became known as the Savior of Paris. According to him, destroying the city would have been an evil and shameful act against a city that is a cradle of culture. However, the French resistance declared that executions and repressions against the Parisian population continued until just hours before the surrender of the German contingent. For them, the city was saved because Choltitz knew that a Nazi victory was impossible and did not want himself and his men to suffer possible reprisals from the Maquis. The streets of the city exploded in scenes of celebration. Entire blocks were turned into dance floors, music played for entire nights, kisses were freely given to the liberators and the resistance fighters without any restraint. Charles de Gaulle addressed the French people on the radio and delivered a speech that will be remembered for posterity. Let's listen to a well-known excerpt from it below, allowing us to use a black and white video, as its epicness is worth it.
Paris, Paris outragé, Paris brisé, Paris martyrisé, mais Paris libéré, libéré par lui-même, libéré par son peuple avec le concours des armées de la France, avec l'appui et le concours de la France tout entière, c'est-à-dire de la France qui se bat, c'est-à-dire de la seule France, de la vraie France, de la France éternelle.
However, we must say not everything was a celebration those days. The Nazi occupation in France left serious and deep wounds in its population. Since its invasion in 1940, hundreds of thousands of French citizens were forcibly taken to Germany, made to work in factories, farms, railways, etc., to benefit the Nazi war effort. The Germans also seized around 20% of French food production, leading to widespread food shortages. The Germans also seized around 20% of French food production, leading to widespread food shortages. 49 concentration camps were built on French soil, where the Jewish population was sent. Over 77,000 died during the war, nearly a quarter of its total population. All these crimes led to French retaliation shortly after liberation. The Nazis who had occupied Paris had already withdrawn, or had been taken prisoner, so the vengeance fell upon the collaborators. Women accused of consorting with the Germans were violently shaved and publicly displayed for the amusement of others. Informers, merchants who conducted business with the invaders, writers, and journalists who advocated collaboration were in many cases executed without trial by French civilians and partisans. Sometimes the severity of the act didn't seem to matter, and mere suspicion was enough for condemnation. It is estimated that in the days following the liberation of Paris, the resistance murdered 20,000 people in French territory. For many, these acts of retribution were not far removed from the atrocities committed by the Germans, and were a stain on what was the glorious liberation of Paris. For others, they were completely justified, as each of the executed individuals collaborated with the regime that terrorized not only France, but almost the entire world. There were also political trials. Philippe Pétain, hero of the First World War where he earned the nickname Lion of Verdun, was the one who signed the armistice with Germany in 1940. In his words, to prevent the destruction of France's rich heritage, he urged the people to collaborate with the Germans. He was found guilty of treason, and only de Gaulle's personal intervention prevented his execution. Nevertheless, he spent the rest of his days in prison. Pierre Laval, the Prime Minister of Vichy France, was not so lucky. After the war, he was executed by firing squad. For most French people, August 25th was a glorious day. In the days that followed, the Allies marched with their victorious troops throughout Paris, starting from the Arc de Triomphe and proceeding down the Champs-Élysées. It is estimated that 2 million people witnessed the parade, 2/3 of the city's population. De Gaulle's victory legitimized his provisional government, replacing the fallen Vichy France and uniting communists, anarchists, nationalists, and others under his banner, at least for a time. Below, we can see the people's celebrations in the recovered streets of Paris.
The thrilling music of the Marseillaise takes on new meaning. Deliverance has come so suddenly to these people, they are slow to realize the nightmare of occupation is over. This is but a foretaste of things to come as the Allies move forward. The V for Victory sign, once the symbol of a hope, is now a reality.
While Paris was free, much of France still remained in the hands of the Germans. Resistance pockets persisted in the country until the end of the war. But, just as the fall of the city was a harbinger of the dark years to come, its liberation appeared as the light at the end of a long and distressing tunnel. We've reached the end of the video, and we'd like to ask you, do you believe the actions of the resistance towards collaborators were justified? Leave your answer in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.